Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Courtney, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, terrific. Well, welcome everybody to this episode, I guess, of the interactive dialogue called What's Gov Got to Do with It? Modern Cooperative Governance in Today's Economy. I will tell you there's already a wager on whether one of us is going to break into Tina Turner's song. I won't tell you who it might be, but we'll see. So in any event, so glad you all are here. A couple of just housekeeping things. This webinar, it is qualified for CLE credit. You'll see the materials and also sign-in information are sent with a response yesterday. We will have Q&A in today's program, and so you'll notice a chat pane in your Zoom field. I don't need to point that out to folks anymore, but if you do have questions, just please note them in the chat. If you'd like to make sure they're confidential, please put confidential question in there. I will do my best to maintain the confidentiality, but no matter what. But if you do want to have me make sure, then put something to that effect and I'll make sure. And we do welcome questions to today's program. So today I'm super delighted to co-present with Courtney Berner. Courtney is the executive director of the University of Wisconsin Center for Co-ops. Courtney, do you want to give a brief personal intro?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I've been at the center as staff since 2011. I started off as a co-op development specialist. So I help people start new cooperatives around the state. That'll come up later in terms of sort of the seed for this project idea. And I became the executive director, I think in January of 2018. I've lost track. So yeah, I'm originally from
COVID thing.
Yeah, COVID. Yes, COVID stole a couple of years. So I'm originally from Oregon, but I've lived in Madison since moving here for grad school in 2009 to get my master's in agroecology. So at some point I will become a badger and will no longer be a duck, but I'll stop there.
Hope springs eternal.
Yes.
Can you give a little overview of what the center is and what your work is?
Absolutely. So the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives is the oldest cooperative center in the country. We do a mix of research, outreach, education on the cooperative business model, and we work with all types of co-ops, worker co-ops, housing co-ops, grocery co-ops, rural electrics, producer-owned co-ops, so the whole range. And really that's one of the sort of two things that make us unique are one, the breadth of sectors that we work with, and two, the range of activities. So we also have a cooperative development program. So we're asking research questions and hopefully trying to answer them. We run 2 national conferences for the ag sector and for grocery co-ops. And we support established cooperatives in our state and again, help people start new cooperatives. So yeah, we have a team of, we just hired 2 new people. So we're up to a team of 7. But serve sort of a national, state and local audiences.
Terrific. And you've got a big co-op conference coming up in California, right?
We sure do. CCMA, which is the National Grocery Co-op Conference, is happening in Sacramento in early June. So
fantastic.
Yes, join us there. If you're from the grocery co-op world, please join us. It should be a great time. It's always a lot of fun.
So I was fascinated to pick this topic for multiple reasons. From my own perspective, I found, I counted up, I'm on, I think, my 8th business cycle now in the course of my professional career. So survivor of all of them so far. And I've definitely found that when the economy becomes uncertain, that's when the importance of good governance, hygiene, and management is really, really important. And making sure that you're kind of prepared for that is really impactful. So it's something that has happened in the recent past of getting contacted by a variety of different co-ops for their looking at their governance. Now, a note for those who are not from the co-op sector, if you're from another business, then please stick around. The information that Courtney is going to discuss, it really is impactful and important for any co-op governed entity. So this weekend, I was actually, or later last week, I was over in Eastern Washington and happened by the Columbia Rural Electric Co-op, the president's note in their quarterly report had to do with the importance of governance and why the members should be paying attention to the board elections, why people should run for the board, et cetera. And coincidentally, the Co-op Center recently ran a very comprehensive governance survey. And Courtney, can you talk a little bit about what that survey was and why do it at the time that it was generated?
Yeah, sure. So, why governance? A couple reasons. Anyone who's heard me talk about this topic has probably heard me say this, but I'm going to keep saying it because I believe it strongly. So democratic member control is one of the things that all cooperatives share. And I often describe democratic member control and sort of member governance as both the superpower and the Achilles heel of cooperatives. So strong governance systems are essential for cooperatives to thrive. Problems in the realm of governance often lead to failure in cooperatives. But there was no data about co-op governance across sectors. And I mentioned earlier that the seed for this idea was planted when I was a co-op development specialist. I'd be working with these new groups, trying to set up new cooperatives, and they had all sorts of questions for me. I was a fairly green co-op developer. They had all these questions for me about, what size should our board be? And what do co-ops of this type do in terms of their meetings and elections, and I didn't really have answers. And I had to slowly build up this treasure trove of anecdotes over the years. And I remember thinking, why is there no data on this? Like, why isn't there somewhere I can go look and understand what is happening in this really important topic within co-ops and something that's shared? So that seed was planted when I, was like on a very steep learning curve as a co-op development specialist in 2011. Fast forward 10 years, it really seemed like a topic as a center. As I mentioned earlier, we work with all types of co-ops. So we're also often looking for issues and questions that apply across sectors. And like I said, democratic member control is one of those through lines for cooperatives. So I went out and talked to leaders from all over the cooperative community and said, hey, we're thinking about collecting this data. It's going to be a lot of work. Do you think it's a good idea or not? Would it be valuable to you or not? I don't want to do it if it won't provide value to co-ops. And they all said yes. So off we went. And you mentioned, Mike, the importance of governance in the context of challenging economic times, in the context of other sort of black swan events like the pandemic. I would add another to the list, and that is the sort of turnover in management that we're experiencing right now of baby boomers who are leaving the workforce. Big shifts in management, new CEO or GM coming in. You really want to make that's where a really important time for the board to be engaged and to have strong systems in place. So I would add that as sort of a third reason. It's like we're going into this time of a lot of turnover and new people coming into important leadership roles, and we need to make sure that our boards are prepared for that that transition as well.
And with change brings opportunity, because you have a new person coming in, fresh set of eyes, opportunity to really look at how we've been organized a good way. And for the information we're presenting here is contained also in a comprehensive report, and we've put a link to that in the materials so that you can get that quickly again from the materials that were sent yesterday. So legal foundations, just so we know kind of level set what we're talking about here. Typically, the legal foundations of corporate governance start with the Articles of Incorporation. Sometimes those are revised, called amended Articles of Incorporation. Obviously, those articles happen in the context of the state jurisdiction that the entity is organized within, and sometimes that is different from the places that they operate. So it's important to know where your organization was initially formed and incorporated. Second is the bylaws, and in some cases, the statutory requirements create legal and contractual duties between the members, people who signed on to the organization, and the organization itself. Often that happens in the context of member agreements, and in some cases as well, there are internal policies that the board adopts to guide itself, kind of pre-make certain decisions so that when the decisions are coming, it is something that they've already considered when it's not in the heat of the moment itself. I'd say among those include, importantly, a base capital policy, which is essentially a policy that the board adopts to say we're going to maintain certain structures around how much equity we retain over the co-op for its ongoing operations. Any other kind of comments, Courtney, from a legal foundation perspective?
Nope, I don't really have anything to add. They're all important. Yeah.
All right, terrific. So tell us a little bit about the survey.
Yep. So we, I will tell you that one of the challenges of cross-sectoral work is we all use different words. You know, if many of you are probably attorneys and you have your own language that you like to use. Now imagine all these different sectors that, you know, describe things in different terminology, have slightly different structures. And so that just writing the survey itself was a challenge. The other big piece was building a list. So there's no list nationally of co-ops that doesn't exist. So in order to pull this off, we had to start somewhere. So we built a list, and we relied heavily on an advisory committee that included leaders from across the cooperative community. And many of their organizations provided their organizational lists with us. So we ended up with a sample of about between 4,400 and 4,500 co-ops, insurance mutuals, and credit unions. So we decided to include all three of those groups in our survey. And so we targeted the CEO or general manager, partly for practical reasons. If, you know, it's hard to get a list of CEOs and GMs of co-ops. It's nearly impossible to get a list of board chairs. They're changing. That information tends to be fairly well guarded. So at least in the ag co-op space, we had 64% of the respondents were CEO, GM. 9% were directors, and about a quarter were someone else. So it could be someone who's responsible for governance.
Like the chief financial officer or something like that?
Exactly. Chief financial, legal counsel is one. Often in larger cooperatives, there's actually one or a few people that are responsible for the governance function and
like a member relations. Yeah,
exactly. Yep. So those types of people.
Did you have separate contact with any of the participants? So you sent out some form of a written survey, right? But then did you follow up with phone calls and interviews?
Yeah, so there was a written survey that went out. We ended up with a response rate of about 11%, which we're like, you send the survey out into the world, and you're like, will anyone take it? Please, God, someone take the survey. We ended up with 500 usable surveys, which we felt really good about. And we asked respondents if they would be willing to do an interview, a follow-up interview, and over half of the respondents said yes, which was incredible. 250. Yeah, it was. We did not have time or resources to talk to all those people because we interviewed 2 people for each co-op. So that would have been like 500, at least 500 interviews. So, but that to us, really, there were several things that demonstrated people's enthusiasm for this survey, and that was one of those metrics. So in addition to the survey and the 500 surveys we collected, we also conducted 21 interviews with people from 11 different cooperatives in 8 different sectors. And in each interview, we tried to select cooperatives that it seemed like they were doing things well in terms of governance. We were like, let's take an aspirational approach in terms of our interviews and maybe glean some information, some stories, some examples of structures and processes that might be useful for other co-ops to know about. So in most cases, we interviewed the person who completed the survey, who was often the CEO or GM, and then the board chair. That wasn't always who we could get, but that's who we tried to.
Did you find anything markedly different from their actual survey responses?
It wasn't things didn't come back differently. The way that we approached many of the questions is we took, so the questions in the survey were, some of them were about, you know, structures, processes. They were sort of yes, no, we do this, we don't do that. And then we had a number of attitudinal questions, you know, how much trust exists between the board and the CEO? Do you think you have the, do you have the right mix of people on the board to govern effectively? So what we did in the interviews is we took many of those attitudinal questions and we either said, hey, when you completed the survey, this is how you answered the question. Can you unpack that for us? What did you mean?
Mhm.
And then in when we interviewed the person who wasn't the respondent, we didn't give away the response. We just said, how would you answer this? And probably in part because we picked co-ops that seem to be really thriving, at least in terms of their governance. The two interviewees typically had very similar responses,
Yeah,
but they just were there was just so much more detail. There was there were stories, there were rationales for why they felt a certain way. So that was just incredibly valuable.
And are those stories summarized in the report itself?
So throughout the report, we sort of pepper there's a section for each area, and we pepper each section with quotes that help to kind of put meat on the bones of the data that we collected, breathe some life into it.
Awesome. So many of the people listening in are from the agriculture industry, and so we've got several components of the survey results from that industry. Did you find that the ag sector respondents were markedly different from other sectors, or was it pretty common across sector?
I mean, it depends on what we're talking, like what we're measuring. And so, of those 500 cooperatives that responded to the survey, 67 of them we've put into like sort of ag sector. And I think, it really depends on what we're talking about. In some ways, agricultural cooperatives are quite similar on some of those attitudinal measures in terms of other structures, using delegates. They were more likely to have delegate structures. Board size, there were some differences. But by and large, there's a lot of difference across all of the sectors.
Got it. And can you talk a little bit about this slide and specifically CGRI versus USDA data, what that involves?
Yeah, one of the things is hard about not having a comprehensive list of co-ops in the United States is it's hard to know then how representative your data is of co-ops in the country. And one of the areas, thank you USDA for collecting this data. So agricultural cooperatives are one of the sectors where we could actually make some comparisons because the USDA actually collects data on agricultural cooperatives. So this bar chart that you see on the right of the slide compares Cougary data to USDA data for geographical distribution. So not surprisingly, Cougary, which is what we affectionately call the Cooperative Governance Research Initiative at the center, our data has an overrepresentation of co-ops in the upper Midwest, particularly Wisconsin, but Minnesota and Iowa as well. Not shocking, we're located in Wisconsin. We have more Wisconsin co-ops on our list. We have more brand recognition. We also found that the Cougary data, there's overrepresentation in the Cougary data compared to USDA data of mid-sized and large co-ops, both in terms of the number of members and annual revenue. So the co-ops in those 67 co-ops skew upper Midwest, and they skew mid-size or larger compared to agricultural cooperatives across the country as a whole. So
interesting. So that kind of leads really to the board composition topic. And there were a couple of results here that I found really interesting. First is that the idea of the average of 11 board members, which seemed high. And can you talk about that and what is meant by 8.5 overall?
Yeah, so the 8.5 overall, that just means that across all 500 respondents, the average board size is 8.5 board members, round up 9. So agricultural cooperatives, at least those that participated in our survey, have larger boards on average compared to the sample overall, which includes worker co-ops, purchasing co-ops, rural electrics, food co-ops, the whole thing, housing co-op. So ag co-op boards are slightly larger, and the range there you see is what we saw was from 4 to 30 board members. This is all ag co-op data. And interestingly, so hybrid cooperatives, we asked, there are a lot of different ways we tried to classify cooperatives. So sector, type, you worker owned, consumer owned, producer owned, multi-stakeholder. And then hybrid versus primary versus secondary. So a primary cooperative is a co-op that's just owned by individual producers. A secondary cooperative is a cooperative of cooperatives. And then a hybrid is both. So like CHS would be a hybrid. They have individual farmer members and they also have cooperatives that are members. So when we looked at board size in hybrid versus primary cooperatives, again, hybrid cooperatives tend to have larger boards, 16 on average, compared to primary cooperatives, which were 10. So that's one of the differences. And then there's a lot. Ag co-ops reported the most change. So we asked, has your board size increased or decreased in the last 5 years? And compared to all of the other sectors, ag co-ops reported the most change.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. So,
did you infer anything from that?
I mean, a couple interesting things. One, mergers were mentioned. So there's a lot, as we all know, there's a lot of mergers happening in this space. And so mergers were commonly cited as a reason for both increasing the board and decreasing the board. So maybe decreasing the board in anticipation of a merger. Maybe you're increasing the board after a merger and then decreasing it slowly. So a lot of flux, I think, likely related to mergers. But interestingly, the most commonly cited reason for decreasing the size of their board in the last 5 years. So 70% of participating ag co-ops that said they've decreased their board size. It was to achieve the efficiencies of a smaller board. And so these, that's a trend that's consistent with consolidation trends among producer-owned co-ops. There's also this sort of increasingly popular hypothesis that smaller equals better when it comes to board size. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think it's more nuanced than that. I would argue that the appropriate size for an individual co-op depends a lot on the size of the co-op, the type of the co-op, the stage of development. And interestingly, one of the things, so we tried to see if there were, correlations between governance practices and self-rated performance. And interestingly, in agricultural cooperatives that participate in the survey that had larger boards tended to rate their performance higher. There was a connection. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of the reason stated for decreasing board size.
Yeah. So that said, I would still argue that there are more, people like to talk a lot about board size, but I think there are a lot more important and strongly correlated determinants of performance than size. But it is interesting, and it's one thing we have control over when we're thinking about how to build our governance structure.
Yeah, I was really struck by the 27% decreasing in size, because that number is so high, and given the number of respondents that you had, which was very significant, that means a very large number of co-ops were decreasing in size in real terms as far as the total number of co-ops. I myself have observed that the larger tend to be harder to manage, and particularly given the consensus style of board decision making, the more people you have in the room, the harder it is to get to consensus, or the more kind of power that loud voices have in the room. And so that's often cited as a reason to start to become more nimble by having a smaller board size, is what I'm kind of told out there. How does that land as far as what the survey respondents said?
I mean, I think no one in the interviews talked about the size of their board. Like that, it wasn't the issue. It wasn't the thing driving effectiveness or strife. So, and granted, I was talking mostly to CEOs and board chairs, but that wasn't the main issue. I do think that I think for co-ops that are larger, having larger boards, or that have larger memberships, having a larger board gives you more opportunity for diversity, for representation, for talent recruitment. We all know that every single member of a board doesn't perform in the same way, in terms of they don't have the same amount of time available to them. So I think that depending on, there's probably a reason that we see larger boards in hybrid cooperatives. They're trying to represent a larger geographic area,
a more diverse business,
businesses. And so I I see both sides of the argument, and ultimately I think what's most as important is how are you running your meetings? You know,
Yeah.
how are you setting your agendas? How are you communicating between the CEO and the board and the membership? So those to me are more important determinants of success.
And how you're making the actual decision.
Exactly. How do you work together if you have 7 people who don't get along? Doesn't matter how efficient it is.
Yeah, exactly. So these were some interesting stats, and not really a surprise to anybody working in the agriculture world, generally speaking. But can you talk to the board composition and both what it was, and then also whether it was viewed as fine or a problem, or what respondents were doing about it, if you know?
Yeah. So, you asked how were ag co-ops different from some other participants in the survey, other sectors, and less gender parity on boards in ag co-ops compared to other sectors. Slightly older board members, although there were sectors that had older on average board members. But yeah, not surprising to any of us who work with ag co-ops, their boards tend to skew older, male, white. So it wasn't a surprise. So, I wouldn't say that it depended on who I talked to, whether or not this was viewed as an issue. The fact that diversifying ag co-op boards is a challenge, partly because of their field of membership, was definitely acknowledged in the interviews, especially regarding racial and ethnic diversity. Many acknowledge that they could and should do better in this regard. So the conversations in the interviews were pretty nuanced, but in the survey, only 14% of participating ag co-ops indicated that they are extremely or very likely to pursue goals related to increasing board diversity in the next 3 years. So not a high priority for ag co-ops.
But also not zero.
Not zero. No,
Yeah.
not zero. I think there were 0% that said they were extremely likely. I think those were all very, not extremely. But maybe this isn't surprising. Average ag co-ops are very confident that the demographics of their current board members mirror those of the membership overall. 2/3 said that the demographics of current board members mirror those of the membership extremely or very well. Only 3% said they mirror them slightly or not at all well. So there is a perception that we represent our members, and that's what's most important. Whether or not that is okay in the context of some of the changing norms and expectations about representation in leadership in businesses in America, we'll see. But yeah, I recognize the challenge of that is one of the challenges of the co-op governance model, is if you are only going to have a board made up of members, that's what you have to recruit from. And there's quite a bit of homogeneity in ag co-op memberships.
And the tenure issue was really interesting. We often are asked about whether it's a good idea, a bad idea to have term limits. And I thought that the percentages here were kind of interesting. Can you talk to the board tenure?
Yeah, so ag co-ops tended to have longer tenure directors than other types of cooperatives. Again, I don't see that as an inherently bad or good thing. What you want is a good spread. You don't want, there's a lot of turnover in food co-op boards, which is really problematic. There are some boards that have had the same members for a very long time. That's problematic. So in terms of what's happening within ag co-ops here, we didn't dig into this too much. I suspect for ag co-ops is probably a combination of a few things. Ag co-op boards tend to, we'll talk about this later, compensate their directors. There are some sectors of the co-op world that don't offer compensation or offer very minimal compensation. Some norms around this is just what you do. Your father or your mother served on the board. It's sort of intergenerational. And something that I hear a lot is just the challenge of recruiting new members, particularly young producers, to serve on the board. So that's probably an element of why there's longer tenured directors in the ag co-op space as well. How to recruit directors I hear that concern a lot. And So some of it may just be this inability or that challenge showing up in because ag co-ops are more likely to have term limits and age limits than other types of cooperatives. So it's not because there aren't term limits or age limits.
So tell me more about that, because that surprises me a little bit.
Yeah,
that they're more likely to have term limits than others.
I mean, it's not a lot more. I don't have the statistic in front of me, but yeah, they were. I mean, part of it is you think about you look at the demographics. So if you are in, let's just use food co-op world or worker co-ops. There tend to be, in a worker co-op, if you have turnover in employees, in a food co-op, if you have turnover in board members, there might be more turnover on the board naturally. And so you may not even think of having term limits. Like, that's not your problem. Bringing new people into the board is not a problem you're trying to solve. You might actually be trying to keep people longer. But if you're in, insurance mutuals and ag co-ops tended to have longer tenured directors. So if you're in a co-op where your challenge isn't keeping directors, it's bringing in new energy, younger producers, younger directors, that's a tool you might use to solve a problem you perceive you have. And so some of that is just reflective of the demographic realities of having older producers and longer tenured, or older directors and longer tenured directors.
Fascinating. And some of these numbers obviously correlate. If you have longer tenure, then you're more likely to be older, et cetera. So it's a interesting dynamic. All right. So apropos of the topic of diversity and diversification, it looks like you were doing partly a forward-looking view of what co-ops were doing as far as their representation and or diversity. Now, this is this related only to the agricultural co-ops, or is this across all sectors?
Nope, that's just ag co-op data.
Got it. And can you walk through the key categories and explain what the objectives were from the survey respondents?
Yeah, so we asked survey respondents to say how likely they were to pursue initiatives related or goals related to diversifying their board. And then those who said they were, I can't remember what the things were, but those who indicated they were interested in pursuing, at least slightly interested in pursuing these goals, we asked them how they would prioritize board diversity along these different metrics. So gender, geographic distribution, where people are located, age, perhaps specific skills or experience. And these were the actual words in the survey. So race, ethnicity, education level, other types of diversity, and then international experience. And so it's not hugely surprising, given what many ag co-ops perceive is the diversity available to them within their membership, that gender would be the top one. So 77% of the co-ops that said they were, interested in pursuing goals related to diversity said that they would prioritize gender diversity, followed by geographic distribution and age. So again, not hugely surprising. In terms of other types of diversity that were mentioned by agricultural cooperatives, the types of commodities or the production type, farm size is another one that came up. And then just general life experiences. I mean, this is one of the things that came up in the interviews around this diversity question. What does the right mix on your board look like? There was a really strong emphasis on different perspectives, different life experiences, different farm operations. That seemed to be where a lot of people's heads were around diversity on the board.
But I've also heard prior experience or non-farm work experience or other specialty knowledge, other boards they might sit on, just for diversifying the skill set of the board itself.
Absolutely.
And the perspectives of those.
And that specific professional skills or experience fell, that was the fourth one, really close to age and geography. So
and these numbers here are a subset, right? Only of the people who said they are somewhat likely or very likely to pursue a goal.
Yeah,
Okay.
if someone said they weren't interested in pursuing diversity at all, we didn't ask them what types. Yeah.
If they were hypothetically, then
Yes.
how was that? So anyway, all right. So the next kind of related takeaway having to do with diversification of the board and recruitment strategies generally. Can you kind of walk through what the questions were here and the responses?
Yeah, so we wanted to understand the different tech, and again, this is like, it's so hard to capture some of this in a survey, but trying to understand, what strategies are you using as a cooperative to recruit directors? And then there's another question that's, I don't think it's in these slides, but is around promoting the opportunity to run for the board as well. And so, we don't really know what the most successful strategies are. It is interesting to me that ag co-ops on the whole are using all of these strategies less frequently than respondents overall. So that blue bar represents all respondents and ag is red. But similarly, the top two strategies are identifying candidates through networks of current directors and through networks of senior management. So it's a bit of an insider's game in that, like, if we are trying to think about how to diversify our board, how to bring in new perspectives, maybe thinking beyond the people we know, the people we associate with, because as we know through network theory, like, they're often more similar to us than different. We tend to associate with people who are similar. And so yeah, I can say that one thread that came out of this, we did ask about, does your cooperative have a committee that
like a nominating committee?
A nominating committee, or a committee that essentially plays that function or serves that function. And ag co-ops with a nominating committee are much more likely to use at least one recruitment strategy relative to those without. I mean, some co-ops didn't use any of these strategies. So they were more likely to use more of these strategies. They were also going back to that. So we asked co-ops to self-rate their performance in 7 areas. And cooperatives that use a nominating committee were twice as likely to rate their financial performance as very good or excellent, as opposed to cooperatives that do not. And 48% of those with a nominating committee rated their ability to deliver value to members as very good or excellent, compared to just 28% of those without. So this sort of coupled relationship between having a nominating committee and this self-rated performance, which again is like it's an imperfect metric, they're imperfect, but it's something. Having a nominating committee seemed to have a pretty impressive impact on that self-rated performance. So
it's a really strong argument in favor of having a nominating committee.
Yeah.
Did that finding vary based on the sector that the organization was involved in?
That's a good question. So I'll just make a plug right now for this report. My dear colleague, Dr. Carrie Jacobs from the University of University of Missouri. Cut that from the recording. University of Missouri, she is the director of GICL. She and I are putting the final touches on an ag sector report. So we have the big master report that reports back on all the data, but Carrie and I have been working on one that's just about ag co-ops. And so we've done deeper analysis in ag co-ops that we haven't done across all of the data yet. So I don't actually know if that holds true across all of the, but it's something that I would like to explore. So.
And did you see any correlation between the size of the co-op and whether or not they had a nominating committee?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. Another good question to add to my list of things to answer. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah. My own experience with discussing nominating committees among co-op boards or other organizations is that a lot of it is really about making sure that you're getting the right kind of expertise on the board, and people who will be active and asking good questions and making sound decisions, and then presenting, not as much as a filter but more on as an additional piece of information about the qualifications of a particular individual to act as a director. So they found it in the ones that have a nominating committee to be very valuable, a very valuable way to make sure that they're getting the diversification of skill base and
Yep.
information on the board.
Well, and beyond recruiting directors, respondents to the survey, listed a lot of other things that nominating these committees do, from putting together, a skills matrix, working on board education and training. Often this lives in like a board development committee. So there are a lot of things that a nominating committee can do to enhance the expertise and of the board, beyond just active recruitment. So.
Did you gather any information about the CEO's role in recruiting people to have interest in running for the board?
Yeah, interestingly, there's sort of two questions we asked that might shed some light on that. Neither is perfect. One is just around CEO service on the nominating committee, and then the extent to which the co-op identifies candidates through the network of senior management, which presumably includes the CEO. So as you can see on this slide, 59% of ag co-ops say that they're identifying candidates through the networks of senior management. But interestingly, in only 3% of participating ag co-ops with nominating committees does the CEO serve on the nominating committee. So compared to, if you look at Cooperative respondents overall, so Cooperative respondents overall that have nominating committees, 23% of them have the CEO and only 3%. So it's very uncommon for the CEO to serve on the nominating committee of an ag co-op board.
And conversely, much more common for other respondents,
Yes.
although still only 23%, which is
still just a quarter. Yeah,
small. So that's a fascinating data point.
And I think that's one of those things that's in certain, there are different sort of cultural norms around a lot of this, and like how management might be involved in governance. And I think for a lot of co-ops, like having a CEO on a nominating committee is like a big no-no. It's like, no, that's like, but it's interesting. So that a quarter though actually do that, because I've always considered it something that isn't done, but just depends on the sector. So
yeah, fascinating. So this discussion point, having myself been a kind of outside director of co-ops and such, was interesting. That nearly a third of the participants allow an outside director, compared to 17% overall, which is a much higher percentage. Can you talk about what you inferred from that?
I mean, I think if you think about one of the key differences in different types of co-ops, like looking at consumer co-ops versus producer co-ops, your field of membership. I mean, I belong to Willie Street Grocery Co-op. I don't know how many members there are now, 40,000, 35,000. So yeah. Your ability to recruit sort of what you might need in terms of diversity, in terms of representation, in terms of expertise is wildly different in a credit union or an insurance mutual or a consumer co-op than it is. I mean, think about what REI Texas, Yeah. So it's just totally different. And so thinking about it's not for me, it's not entirely surprising that ag co-ops, that some of which have very large memberships, but many of them, most of them don't have 30,000 members, that they might deploy this tool, which is really a tool for bringing in outside expertise, potentially subject matter expertise. It's a tool that's often used to diversify a board, to maybe represent a subset of the membership that isn't well represented. We talked about farm size earlier. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't hugely surprised by this, but given how it's one of those hot button issues that people have pretty strong opinions about, I was surprised that it's as high as a third, given some of the fervor around the debate about the appropriateness of having outside directors serve on the board.
So in that debate, is there a discussion about whether the outside director would be allowed to vote?
I mean, I think that, so I can tell you that in our data, the co-ops, the ag co-ops that do allow outside directors, 60% of them allow those outside directors to vote on board matters. So it's a little more than half, 60%. So
much higher than I would expect.
Yeah, I mean, what has been your experience? When you've been an outside director, did you get to vote? And is there chatter about that, or is it accepted as just part of the rule?
Well, yeah, I'd say a couple things in response to that. Number one is that most of the time, in my observation, both representing entities and also in my own roles, it's been a non-voting position. And when I'm working with co-ops on designing their governance structure, the main reason for that is that because the outside director by definition is not a member, there's a view that they won't necessarily represent the
Mhm.
membership and how the membership would feel, which in some ways is exactly why you have outside directors. So in any event, and then the other piece of it that I've observed in some cases, not myself, but observing other outside directors and what made for somebody who was really good and someone where it was challenging. The really good people are extremely reserved in what they say or do in the boardroom because their viewpoint is often viewed by the other members as carrying extra weight. And so they don't want to skew the view. They want to maybe ask questions and much more Socratically. And so I think, I always recommend, in addition to looking for a skill set for an outside director, it's really important, maybe even more important, to get the temperament.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, finding, good outside directors enhance the dialogue without becoming the default expert in the room. That you don't like, the last thing you want is directors turning to that outside director for answers. How do they, exactly what you said, ask questions, add unique perspective, and enhance the dialogue.
So I'll give a specific example. I was on working with a co-op board, and they had an outside director who had been an operating CEO in a kind of somewhat related industry, and they were having financial difficulty. And so the outside director got up and basically gave a mini seminar on how to manage cash in a crisis, and then sat down and said nothing.
Yeah.
Like not how to do it, not, et cetera, but more kind of set the framework, made sure everybody had questions answered, and then did not opine about what the right path was. They needed to make that decision as their board.
Yep.
So, all right. Again, a related question here is board compensation. And the numbers are interesting just, in general, but did you find that it differed based on whether they were outside directors? I mean, do they pay more or more likely to pay if there was an outside director?
So this slide right here is just regular directors, so non-officers, because many co-ops actually pay, I think it was like 85% of participating ag co-ops that provide board compensation pay board officers at a higher rate. So this is not officers, this is non-officer directors. Super interesting. I found this very interesting. So across all ag co-ops, the average compensation for a director is $15,695. But for an outside director, it is $33,000, so almost twice as much. But if you break it down by hybrid versus primary cooperatives, in hybrid co-ops, which tend to be bigger, the average compensation for regular directors and outside directors is almost the same. There's very little difference. It's when you drop down into primary cooperatives and average outside directors are compensated almost twice as much as regular directors in primary co-ops. So not a lot of difference in hybrid co-ops, a lot of difference in primary co-ops in terms of outside versus inside directors.
And again, primary meaning producer only.
Producer owned, yeah, so your local co-op. Yep.
Got it. So the next few slides I'm going to go through pretty quickly. Some really interesting reports here on ways that the co-op onboards new members of the board, right? And did you find in your results that there was like a primary person whose job it was to do that? Is it the board chair, the CEO, some other person?
We didn't actually ask those questions. We didn't ask who was responsible for these processes, onboarding or ongoing training. So I don't know. I will say that in many cases, the board chairs that we interviewed and the CEOs talked explicitly about their role in making sure, I think a former board chair said, my most important job was making sure that there were, 9 people sitting or 11 people sitting around the table who were ready and able to participate meaningfully, who had the knowledge and the expertise and the disposition. And so, but no, we didn't ask that in the survey. So.
Got it. Also, just an interesting note that the differences between the hybrid and primary co-ops is pretty significant in certain categories.
Yes,
So,
yeah, I would love to see these all at 100% for everyone, but
yeah,
that's why we'll collect the data again in 2024. So keep
there
collecting
you go.
benchmark.
Next brief topic is board training, and I thought that was interesting that in 100% of the hybrid co-ops, it looks like roughly, they receive fiduciary duty and responsibility training. 88%, which is much higher than I would think, actually, for the primary. So that was kind of interesting. Any other key takeaways on this topic?
I mean, I would just say that we're doing a pretty good job in some of these core topics, fiduciary duties, what's the co-op? I mean, presumably the number for hybrids is pretty low, but presumably by the time you're elected to a hybrid co-op board, you better know a bit about the co-op model. You probably served on other boards on your way to that board. Where we're not doing as much as in these, I don't like the phrase soft skills because I actually think they're quite hard. But conflict resolution, meeting facilitation, there's a lot of room for growth in some of these issues that are related more to interpersonal dynamics, to our ability to disagree and still work together really productively. So I'd love to see some movement on the bottom tier of board training topics.
In particular for the board chair who's really running the show on the board meetings themselves.
I would argue I'm a huge proponent of meeting facilitation training for everyone because you are a better participant if you understand what that facilitator is trying to achieve. So
yeah,
I'm pro facilitation training for all board members.
Love it. New idea out there of doing evaluations for board members. What does an evaluation mean in this context?
I mean, it could mean so the different words you see on the x-axis here. So we asked about the different types of board evaluations and how their frequency. So board as a whole would just be, you're evaluating the performance of the board as a whole. Individual board member evaluations be where you're actually evaluating your peers. So like if Mike and I were on a board together, I'd be like, I think Mike did great on this and he could really do a lot better here. And he would get to do the same for me. Board chair, you're just evaluating the performance of the board chair, and then board committees, the same. So often board evaluations include some self-evaluation as well, where you're evaluating your own contributions. But this is one of the more surprising findings actually for me, was the large percentage of co-ops that are not doing board evaluations.
I would actually, my reaction was the opposite. I was surprised at how many were doing some.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know what you take from that.
Well, I'll have just one anecdote. We gave a training last week, a governance training, and we talked about board evaluations. And it was interesting. A couple of the directors who were attending said, you know what? We have such a hard time recruiting and keeping directors. We're afraid that if we do evaluations, it will scare them away.
It will scare them away.
I know. Yeah. So, but I think they're an important practice.
Yeah. It's at least a data point.
Yes.
For sure. So, all right. And then this one was interesting, also worthy of its own seminar. But the question is how well does the board understand its role in relation to management? And really, this is a matter of what the kind of board's role is in overseeing management specifically. And I find this particularly hard in co-ops because, of course, the definition of being a co-op member is to use the products or services of the organization. And that means that your daily contact point is the person you probably have the most of a relationship with, even as a board member. It's not the CEO. It's whoever that contact point is with you in the store, on your farm, et cetera. And so that is an interesting kind of challenge. So what did you find in this area?
I mean, in ag co-ops, there's quite a bit of confidence that the board does understand their role. I think one of the things that really came out in the interviews, and this is elucidated in these quotes, is, you know, the sort of the idea that the board develops strategy and the CEO implements strategy just isn't really the case anymore, that it's much more of a partnership, and that, you know, I had a board chair that I interviewed who said, you know, against everything I've been told and all the board trainings I've gone to, like, the CEO develops strategy. He's working in the business every day. I'm not. And so we're here to vet strategy, to ask good questions, to ask to tweak it, to send it back and say, not quite this, or like, have you thought about this? And to really serve as a screen and a mirror and the member's voice. And so I think there's a shift happening, particularly in larger cooperatives, around that role, and sort of some pushback on the conventional wisdom that the board develops strategy and the manager carries it out. So yeah, that was.
I would say with that, I've seen nothing but problems if the board kind of goes around the CEO to try and manage employees that work for the CEO or in the staff. So that for me is a hard line for sure. All right, well, we've got just 2 more substantive slides and we're going to go through them fairly quickly. First is the legal steps that are that a co-op or any other organization really would go through. First is you want to understand which changes to bylaws or other kinds of information require votes by the board, votes by the members, etc. Sometimes your organizing statute or articles of incorporation set minimum requirements for either quorum, the percentage of vote, whether certain things have to be taken to the members as well. Sometimes the bylaws have minimum requirements. So it's important to understand just what you want to change and then how you would go about undertaking that change. For sure, you want to have a very robust plan for member communications, even if no vote is required, so that members know what's happening, why it's happening, that kind of a thing. And then I do recommend periodically looking at your governance structure, even, and I'd say maybe especially when times are good, anticipating downturns, because when times are good, you're more likely to get positive votes and the like. All right, so we always end with 5 things that you can do today to improve your organization, or sometimes not 5, sometimes 4, sometimes 10. But this time we took 5. So Courtney, can you very briefly walk through these 5 things?
Absolutely. So these were co-created by Mike and myself. So 1, regularly review your bylaws, membership agreements, and policies, and update as needed. There's this credit union in Canada that once told me about this, like every 5 years they do a governance audit. Incredible. So build it into your calendar. 2, thoughtfully prioritize meeting topics to keep the board focused on the issues that matter most. This came up a lot in the conversations, and often the CEO was the one that was driving change in the agenda and saying, put strategy at the beginning. We're not doing management reports during our meetings. They come out written ahead of time. 3, deploy diverse board development strategies and clearly delegate authority for recruitment and onboarding. Recruiting from existing networks is not bad, but let's think beyond that. 4, whether through training or engaging outside directors, actively cultivate your board's expertise and business acumen. There are a lot of ways to build up expertise. It's not just outside directors. It doesn't just have to be training. And lastly, one of my favorite Peter Drucker quotes, culture eats strategy for breakfast, so ignore social and interpersonal dynamics at your peril.
So in the context of the board structure and your governance structure, how do you make sure that you reflect that culture in how you operate?
I mean, I think their culture, as we know, is seen and unseen. So there are ways you can codify culture in your written documents. That list that Mike provided at the beginning of the presentation, your bylaws, your policies, a code of conduct. So there are places we write down, job descriptions, committee charters,
including a board member job description.
Exactly. There are places that we write down how we're expected to behave. And so those are important. But then also having a really strong board chair, strong CEO that are actively cultivating that culture that you're looking for in board meetings and all communication. So it's, I think having mentor programs for new directors can be really powerful. Those were mentioned several times, and can help new directors, give them a place to ask some of those questions that they might be uncomfortable asking in a full boardroom, and help again with the culture piece.
Awesome. Well, with that, thank you, Courtney, as always, so much for your wisdom and also your efforts on behalf of the entire industry. For those who have any follow-up questions that you'd like to ask, first, I really commend to you the full survey report. It's quite comprehensive and detailed and has a lot of information. You can reach out to either of us to answer any questions that you have or present your own comments as well. We'd love to have those reactions. Some other kind of follow-up things. If you want CLE credit, just complete the sign-in form, then the certificate will be sent back to you with that information. This will be also recorded, and so if you have any colleagues that would be interested in the information, please don't hesitate to send it to them. And we do have a book on co-op law, which includes some of the governance structure issues that we talked about here. And so I commend that to you as well. So with that, Courtney, thank you to all of our participants. As always, thank you so much for participating.
Yep, thank you.